2026 has been the year when all of the fears that we might not go back to normal have really started to take hold. Conversations in boardrooms and with investors have been completely different in 2026 compared to any other previous point in my career. I believe President Trump has said that a deal was imminent something like 38 times. And here we are around day 100. Those of you who've been following us and our views will know that we were counter consensus from the beginning in suggesting that this would be a long war, not like the expectations that market participants had for a June 2025 style of conflict. And unfortunately, that has turned out to be the case. But we have this kind of stalemate at the moment, which is, exactly what we suggested it would be: episodic inflammation of tensions and strikes.
I think that the direction of travel is clearly from what one might have called automatic Atlanticism, but not toward a clean divorce, right? Europe has not moved on from the US in the sense of abandoning NATO or the use of US intelligence or even US nuclear guarantees or certainly US defense technology. But it has moved on, I think, from the assumption that the US is a permanently reliable strategic anchor. And I think that from that point of view, there has been a real transformation in Europe. The Greenland shock, I think, accelerated something that was already underway. The biggest fallout is in defense planning, right? Europe is really shifting from more spending to please Washington to more capability in case Washington leaves.
Trump has vowed more strikes on Iran today if they don't make a deal. Well, I think we can have some confidence around the idea that Iran will not cave in on US terms. And that is another element of how the power dynamic in the Middle East has changed so much as a result of this war, but not in the way that the US and Israel hoped it would, in that Iran is holding more cards. And even though its navy has been obliterated, it's suffered casualties, including in the upper echelons of its leadership, they're still standing, and they think that time is on their side.
Since Brexit, we have seen far fewer calls from populist parties to leave Europe or even to leave the euro, for example. We've also seen other developments, such as the fact that mainstream right-wing parties and groups, both in the European Parliament, but for example in Germany and in France and in Italy, have been much more willing to work with right-wing populists, which essentially means that I think that to some extent they are becoming a little bit less stigmatized. They are becoming partners that mainstream parties are willing to work with. Populist movements have matured, they've internationalized, and they've actually embedded themselves, much more forcefully, I would argue, in various landscapes. The fact is that the kind of uncertainty and the kind of deadlock that they impose on politics at the national level and potentially even at the European level is something that is very bad news for investors.
I do think we are looking at both the war in Ukraine and this kind of stalemate, neither peace nor war in Iran, carrying out through the end of this year. If Russia was looking for a moment to, expose NATO as a paper tiger, for example, or to broaden the war, its window for doing so is in the next couple of years, right? Before Europe has had a chance to rearm.
Europe will want two messages, I think, to be heard very, very clearly. The first is that Ukraine must be at the table. This is what they've been saying from the beginning. This is what they've been saying from the get-go. And then the second, again, something they've been saying often is that Europe must be in the room, particularly France, Germany, and the UK. I think that the EU has sharpened its resolve, certainly rhetorically,
Mm.
as well as institutionally. The real test is whether it can turn all the talk of sovereignty into procurement and investment, right? So my sense is the new package is important, but it's more a direction of travel document rather than a momentous break or a tipping point in terms of operational action. Europe is no longer talking only about regulating US tech. It's now trying to build alternatives. I think that that's very important. It is giving preference, obviously, to European capacity, and it's trying to reduce its strategic dependence.
The biggest news this week has probably been the inflation print in the United States coming in a little bit above expectations. And in this environment, inflation is political too, because of course the war in Iran, now into its 100th day, is contributing to that inflation. We would expect that to, potentially have an impact on consumer sentiment, of course, but also on public opinion ahead of midterms. Even though President Trump's approval ratings are low for a president at this stage in his term at 36%. And we saw when we showed you the data on G7 leaders, he's more popular than Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron. But that core of 36% is fairly solid, despite the war in Iran, despite inflation and everything else. But Democrats are much less popular. And this is really important to keep in mind.